Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are now going to be diving into the play-in game between the Chicago Bulls and Atlanta Hawks. We talked about the Sixers Heat game earlier. This one definitely had a different feel offensively as it was much higher scoring. The Bulls win 131-116, and that's in part due to the fact that the Hawks defense has really been struggling, especially as of late. But I want to focus a little bit more on the positives, of course, here. That's the type of enjoy basketball mindset that we have here at the GSMC Sports Podcast. But it was Coby White scoring a career-high 42 points in this game. That was just so fun to watch. He was a candidate for Most Improved Player, probably going to be the runner-up in the award, but I think should be the winner. And what he was able to do in this game, it's just so fun to watch him. Again, Atlanta doesn't necessarily have this dominant post defense, and that is very much underselling the struggles they have in the paint for the Hawks here. But Coby White, with some of the ball handling, the patience, and the angles that he takes to get to the rim, it's so fun. He just slithers his way in with the lateral steps and finds his way and has great touch at the rim as well. So he scores a career high. Now, technically, this doesn't count, which is sort of what I was talking about in the first segment as well. The NBA has to find some sort of way to classify these games so they don't just go into a blank void in terms of NBA statistics. Even if it is its own category, it's got to be something, because right now it's not regular season, it's not playoffs, and it's almost unofficial, similar to how the in-season tournament was earlier this season. But again, it was Coby White really leading the way here. DeMar DeRozan also was masterful. His numbers don't maybe pop off quite as much based off of how things played out here, but he was the one who, he's just such this steadying presence for Chicago, and he's always been a pro's pro, but he got the game started off right with 11 points. He was 5 of 7 from the field, had 5 assists, and from that point, again, took a little bit of a backseat, which is what he's done at times. You see, I mean, seriously, if you watch some of the stuff that he does off ball, it's almost this on-the-court coaching mindset where he directs a lot of traffic, specifically offensively, for the growth of Coby White this season. I feel like there are times where you sort of see Coby White with the ball, with a defender that he can get by on him, and he will, this has happened on a couple instances, he'll look over to DeMar, and DeMar will point at him saying go, and he does, and ends up capitalizing on it. I think that he is such an incredible presence for a team. I feel like you can say that with a handful of these Bulls players, and then you look at their record, you say, how are they 500? How has this organization not made a player transaction in terms of a trade since 2021? They're just letting all of these solid players sort of waste away in this mediocrity. But at the same time, they have a chance to actually officially make the playoffs this year when they face off against the Miami Heat on Friday in a rematch of last year's play-in tournament, where the Bulls actually had the lead in that one late in the fourth quarter and let it fall from their grasp. But I thought something that sort of added in to how impressive this win was over Atlanta was the fact that Alex Caruso was dealing with an injury throughout. He ended up getting run over, just straight steamrolled by Andre Drummond very early in that second quarter. Drummond stepped on his foot and just sort of ran through him. Quite the embodiment of the Bulls can't seem to get out of their own way, but Caruso ended up limping to the bench, had a heat pack on his foot for the majority of the game. I think he briefly checked in the third quarter, but he didn't play very much in this game, only 17 minutes. He obviously, their all-defense caliber guard that is going to be a big loss for them, assuming that this is a serious injury and they have a chance to advance to the playoffs if they can win on Friday. We don't necessarily have updates on that specifically at the moment. Sort of alluded to him earlier in the show, but I mean, some of these second round picks that they've just hit on in recent years, it's Ayo Dosunmu, and then Dalen Terry was actually a late first round pick. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head here, but both of them have just emerged as real contributors for Chicago this season. And the level of, guard forward play, they just seem to have depth. And again, sometimes I look at this Bulls team and I just question why they aren't better than they are. And in large part, it is due to the fact that their defense is pretty mediocre. They finished the regular season 21st in defensive rating. I think a big issue with that is the fact that as much as Nikola Vucevic does show some, real promise, obviously, as an offensive scorer. I believe he's a 2-time All-Star, at least a 1-time All-Star, but he doesn't really have a great paint presence as much as I like Coby White as well. Some of the attentiveness with him, he can get sort of caught in off-ball situations. I'm sure it seems like that guy has one of the highest motors in the league in terms of not just on the court play, but some of the stories that you hear about him, it seems like he's extremely driven to be better. He wants to live up to the draft pick that he was selected with. I believe it was the 7th overall pick. I gotta have more of these draft numbers ready on hand. I didn't realize I was going to be talking about draft selections quite as much as I was today. But he was selected 7th overall in that 2019 class that does have a handful of players who have sort of emerged as, prominent role players, some even better than that in Zion and Ja, of course, but having a bunch of these guys sort of finding their success, he seems like he really wants to continue to improve. Obviously, most improved player candidate this season, and should be a lot of fun to see, I think, monitoring his growth in the coming years, because he's still only 24 years old, just turned 24, so I see a lot of promise with him. An example of why not to give up on players so early in their career. But we will, I guess, now be moving on to the idea of the Atlanta Hawks in this situation, where I know that the final score is 15, and the Hawks were actually in the game in the third quarter, went on a little bit of a run to make this a little bit more contested, but they were so unable to get stops. Now, Trae Young is going to be a big story out of this one. His stat line ends up looking okay, 22 points and 10 assists, but he was coming back. This was only his 4th game back from injury, I believe, after breaking his thumb, or it was one of his fingers. It looked like he had his ring finger and pinky finger tied together, or taped together, I should say, in that second half. But Trae was really struggling early in this game, had 5 turnovers in the first half, and in a handful of these instances, it seemed like it wasn't even the decision-making with it, but he just didn't have almost the right feel on the ball itself. Now, I'd have to go back and look at specifically what hand these turnovers were sort of caused by, but there was a level of frustration from DeJounte Murray headed into halftime where Trae threw this, I wouldn't call it reckless necessarily, it was a behind the back pass to DeJounte Murray on the perimeter that if it had hit him, right in the chest, it would have been fine. DeJounte could have gotten a shot up, but it was off. Forced DeJounte into a little bit of a compromising situation. The Hawks didn't get off a shot in that instance, and Murray was definitely frustrated with Trae, which does sort of signify this idea of what are the Hawks going to do in the offseason, they decided not to trade DeJounte Murray during the trade deadline. Trae Young then goes down with an injury, and the reason why the Hawks didn't trade DeJounte is seemingly because of the fact that DeJounte was sort of not performing to the level of his expectations. I mean, that's sort of understating it almost, from when they traded multiple first-round picks for him a couple years ago, and it didn't seem like they were seeing eye to eye with some suitors in terms of what his value would be, and so they decided to stick with him. Trae Young then soon gets injured afterwards, and we see this version of DeJounte really sort of asserting himself once again, and he was really good in this game, specifically in the first half. He really got himself cooking in the second quarter, notably in the minutes where Trae Young was on the bench. In the first 4 minutes of the second quarter, DeJounte Murray had 10 points, and the Hawks ended up outscoring the Bulls by 13 in that stretch there. Now, again, very small sample size, would be reckless to sort of say that is make a bigger deal out of that than things currently stand, but I do think the Hawks are going to have to make a change. It doesn't seem like that DeJounte and Trae Young backcourt is something that is sustainable in terms of winning a finals. Now, the move itself, when they made it, was definitely a little overly ambitious. They had just made the Eastern Conference Finals in a little bit of a weird year. I forget who they played in the first round, but then they got a 76ers team with an injured Joel Embiid. That was, of course, the Ben Simmons series where his brain broke and he just hasn't been the same since. But, you know, I think that to some degree the Hawks are going to have to try and salvage what they have left here, and they're going to have to make a decision between DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. And I have never been a massive Trae Young fan. I also understand that you can't just look at how he performed in both this game and sort of the last few games of the regular season and say this is why DeJounte is better, because Trae Young had just missed over a month with an injury and was clearly still dealing with it at this point. But I do think that you can sort of undisputably get more in a trade package for Trae Young than you can for DeJounte Murray, and that's something that maybe kick the tires on. Again, see what type of teams are out there available. There have been rumors about the Spurs potentially wanting to go and get Trae Young. Something that I noticed, and again, not to blow things out of proportion by any means, but it did just seem like, obviously, and the reputation around Trae a little bit, is he racks up these assists, but their majority just through a pick and roll game. He doesn't really run a team style offense. All 6 of his assists in the first half were to Clint Capella in a 2-man game. A couple lobs and a couple nice passes, but also sort of some of them a little bit more underwhelming. I definitely wouldn't say that he was this great team player dishing out 6 assists in the first half. Now, he had a couple more driving kicks to the corner where there were even some instances where his teammates didn't come through for him. And I don't know, this Hawks team is just very interesting now. They also were missing 2 of their young forwards in Saddiq Bey and Jalen Johnson because they were injured earlier this season. So there's a lot of pieces here. I'm not sure how they're going to play this out. Part of the reason I also sort of entertain the possibility, I'm not saying 100% do it, but the possibility of trading Trae Young is because of the fact it would have been very strange, I think, for them to, even if they didn't see eye to eye with other teams surrounding DeJounte Murray's contract situation, you still his value, I should say, you still knew that Trae and DeJounte really weren't a match in the backcourt. I don't think I'm breaking any news, really, by making that type of a statement. And if you knew that you weren't going to pay him this offseason, I do think it would be a little weird for them to hold on to him just for the sake of it. But definitely curious what you all think about that situation, because I feel like the Hawks have one of the more difficult off seasons to manage, as they are currently sitting around this little bit of mediocrity. But I'm also a huge fan of what Jalen Johnson put out there this season. I think if he had qualified with the 65 games played, he would have been a prime candidate for most improved player as well. Saddiq Bey is somebody who has seen some ups and downs since he has entered the league, but has showed just a ton of reliability for the most part. I know that he had a little bit of a slump shooting-wise in his second season, but is somebody that, especially in a Trae Young system, I think could probably flourish some. But again, let me know what you think the Hawks should do in the offseason. I'm sure we will dive into that much more when the time calls for it. But we're going to be now taking our final break. And when we come back on the other side, we will be diving into the ESPN story that was released, I believe it was yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, surrounding Bill Belichick and his offseason prospects, and how Robert Kraft could have sort of meddled into that situation. So stick with us, and we will be right back.